The world is changing fast, and so are the local real estate markets. Don't worry, though. We've got you covered. Welcome to the Real Estate Revolution.
Hello, everybody. This is the Real Estate Revolution podcast. I am Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate. I have Ryan Neal in the studio today, and we have another great show for you today. We are going to be talking about negotiations, and we're going to get down to the granular here. We've talked about the importance of knowing the particulars of what a seller, what are the right buttons to push to get a seller to gravitate towards your offer. But we really haven't taken the time to talk about specifics on the types of different scenarios that we encounter when helping our buyers negotiate to get into contract with a seller. So what do you think of that topic today, Ryan?
Yeah, it's a great topic, obviously very central to the whole process of real estate. Of course, a seller is going to come in with an asking price, but we all know that, especially in the kind of market we have right now, it's very rarely going to be where a sale actually ends up. So there are all sorts of different things that go on between a seller setting a particular price on their home and then coming out at the end of the day, the particular amount.
Yeah. So let's get the weekly market report in the books today, and then we will come back with negotiations 303.
All right. First, I have our weekly update on mortgage rates. To preface, I'd like to note that the rates you see online generally aren't all that up to date. We're getting our numbers directly from Brad Towser of Mortgage Express, and he tells us that 30-year fixed rates in Oregon right now are averaging right around 5.5%. So that's another pretty big jump in just a short period of time. I want to put these rate increases in context a bit. So let's say you're purchasing a home at $500,000 with 20% down. Your monthly payment now at 5.5% would be about the same as it would have been on a $586,000 property back when the rates were closer to 4%. So that's a pretty big loss of purchasing power, and the effects are already starting to trickle down into our local markets. We'll just see what the numbers tell us. So let's look back at the month of March as a whole. Across the board in Eugene, Springfield, Bend, and Redmond, we're seeing inventory increases. Eugene and Springfield are at about 0.6 months of inventory, while Bend and Redmond are closer to 0.7 months. And that's after several months of inventory dropping near or below 0.5 months. So that's good news if you're looking to buy a home and you've been despairing about the lack of choices in the market. But it's also typical for the early spring to see more sellers start to put their homes on the market, and of course we have a lot more buyers starting to look for homes. Rising mortgage rates will naturally have an impact, and that seems to be especially the case in Bend, where of course we have very high prices. In March, sale prices dropped in Bend, Eugene, and Springfield month over month compared to February, but not in Redmond, where we saw some modest increases in sale prices. Looking at pending sale data, prices should drop further in April in Bend, Redmond, and Springfield. Home shoppers, they just don't have as much buying power as they did a short while ago. And as a result, they're making less aggressive offers, and sale prices are dropping. In Eugene, though, prices look to be on the way up again. Looking at our pending sale numbers, we're seeing those properties at a median of $460,000, which would, be a fair amount of appreciation. But basically, none of our markets are showing signs of any significant shifts on the horizon. The median sale price is coming down significantly in Bend, based on the pending sale numbers, it'll come down about 10% in April. But we have to keep in mind that Bend's high-end market was on fire during the winter. There was just a ton of activity, and that part of Bend's market is cooling down. At the same time, homes at the lower half of Bend's market are, for the most part, selling for just about as much as ever. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at the overall sale numbers for Bend. The bottom line is, don't wait for prices to drop any further. It's probably not going to happen. If and when interest rates do rise further, as a buyer, unlikely to be in any better position than you are right now. Sellers can benefit right now from the usual spring FOMO, fear of missing out, and with inventory likely increasing further into the summer, you might face less competition right now compared to later on. Still, as a seller, probably any time during the warmer months should be a fine time to list your home. Anyway, that does it for this week's market report. On to the main part of our show.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Revolution podcast. I'm Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate. Ryan Neal in the studio today. Hello, Ryan Neal.
Kip Lohr, hello.
We are going to talk negotiations. And I thought what would be interesting is rather than talk theoretical or hypothetical, we would share some recent experiences with buyers that we've helped or are continuing to help in the last few months, which will highlight a few different scenarios and hopefully show that the landscape for negotiations is much broader than just being the highest price or being the highest price cash offer. So with no further ado, let's start with some examples. What comes to mind to you?
Yeah, so, just during the past several months, we've had a number of buyers coming both into the Eugene, Springfield, and Bend, Redmond areas from out of state. And it's always an interesting process when you're unfamiliar with the area. And, in many cases, we've had buyers who are looking at properties remotely. So one of our specialties, of course, is helping people relocate from out of area. And part of the service that we provide is giving people these kind of virtual tours of homes. We'll go to properties and we'll give video tours and show as much as we possibly can what's going on with these different properties and answer people's detailed questions over Zoom.
Yeah. And so that kind of is an extension of folks looking at the pictures and reading the descriptions. And some of the homes will offer some virtual tours, but they're kind of a very stock, quick overview. Some of them are just taking the pictures and just moving the pictures to make them feel like they are a, video tour. And so what we do is we schedule an appointment for a client and do a live video tour as if we're showing them the home live to them. They're walking through the home. That gives them an opportunity to say, hey, wait, look to the left, look to the right. What's that on the floor? I want to get a closer look at what the kitchen sink looks like. And so it really gives them an opportunity to get a more in-depth look at the home.
And obviously it's ideal, and in many cases essential to actually set foot in a physical property. But part of the idea here, behind how we do these virtual tours is that we want to get to know you as much as we possibly can. And if possible, we want you to come to the Eugene, Springfield area, to the Bend, Redmond area, and we want to show you different properties so we can really get a flavor for what really makes you tick, what it is that you're really looking for in a property, so that later, when you return home and you see something pop up on the internet that looks compelling to you, we can get in there and we feel like we have enough of a connection with you that we can kind of fill in the blanks. And we have enough of a sense that both of us can feel comfortable if you do decide to pull the trigger, writing an offer on a property sight unseen.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, I have a client that comes to mind as far as a negotiation tactic that we used where they came into town from out of area. We did this patented Lohr Real Estate city tour of Eugene and, looked at a few homes while they were here in addition. And we were able to get a sense of kind of what they were looking for in a home and what their vibe was. And so when they went back, in this case, they were in Montana. And when they went back to Montana, they had identified a property that came on the market and had been on the market for one day. And this was a property that we knew was going to be on and off the market very quickly, that there was going to be a lot of competition for. And their situation is they were just getting ready to close on their home in Montana and would have cash to purchase a home in Eugene. So we did a video tour of this home and they fell in love with it and they decided they wanted to make an offer on it. And in this particular case, this is one of those typical situations that we find today in both the Eugene, Springfield, and Bend, Redmond area where the property goes on the market on Thursday. They're going to do an open house on Saturday or Sunday, and then the seller is going to make a decision on offers by Monday. So in this particular case, we were doing the video tour on Friday. It was a Friday afternoon when they decided they wanted to make an offer. I reached out to the agent who I know very well and have done several transactions with in the past, and basically said, look, my folks are all cash. they are ready to go. We are going to make a substantially higher than list price offer, but we're only going to do that if your seller is willing to make a decision today. So we compress the decision-making time to hopefully detour other folks from being able to see the home and other offers to be able to come in. And part of it was skill. Part of it was luck. The listing agent was getting ready to go on vacation, was eager to get that transaction off the books, and trusted that we could get the deal done for them. So she reached out to her seller and said, okay, this is the terms that these folks are willing to come in at. Do you want to get into contract, or do you want to wait through the weekend and see if we can get a bidding war going on? And in our case, they were willing to go into contract that day. And we came in with a offer that was $50,000 above list price, which was very generous, and, kind of the stars aligned. But the highlight here for this particular negotiation technique is sometimes you really can push the envelope on dictating how quickly the seller has to make a decision. Create a little FOMO for the seller to say, okay, we're going to come in strong, but if you guys aren't willing to make a decision today, you're not likely to get our best offer. And the stars aligned, and we were able to get our folks into contract that day and avoid other offers coming in, avoid a bidding war on that transaction. So that's one example of a technique of negotiation that is kind of high level. Not all agents are going to be thinking along those lines, even though they know that they've got a buyer that's rolling around with all cash.
Yeah, I think the typical thing is that, us agents, when we see a listing, we see details that the public doesn't see. Like if you're going on Zillow, then there are public remarks, which everybody's going to see, but there are also private remarks that are part of any listing that can only be seen by other agents. So one thing which might be included in the private remarks is that we're going to review offers at a certain date at a certain time. And I think when most agents see that, they pretty much take it for granted that, okay, these are the rules of the game. This is what's going to happen. When a seller is setting a particular deadline, they're expecting multiple offers. So we're probably going to be in a multiple offer situation. There's going to be competition, so we're going to proceed accordingly. It takes a little bit more creativity to read behind the lines and see that, there's kind of always room to bend those parameters a little bit. And I think in this particular situation that you're talking about, Kip, there's a particular psychology, that I think we ended up being able to take advantage of here, which is that a seller is oftentimes going to want to go for a sure thing, right. Even if waiting, potentially promises a greater return in the end. If we're presenting an offer and we're saying, hey, this is what we've got right now, but if we have to wait through the weekend for you to review this offer, then, hey, our folks, they might have found a different place. They might have changed their mind. Something might happen in the meanwhile. A seller, there's going to be some fire under their butts to take advantage of this. Like you said, there's a sense of FOMO which ends up being created. Yeah,
and it's kind of like the bird in the hand, right? So they have a sense of security, and I think the key elements to this particular negotiation was the relationship that we had with that agent. She was able to say, look, these guys are serious. We know that when they say they can do something, they can do it. So if they're going to tell me that this is what they're going to do, that's exactly what they're going to do. That can be conveyed to their seller and give that seller confidence that this is a strong offer. Let's lock them in just so we don't lose out on them. Because if we had run into the situation on that particular negotiation where the seller's like, no, I want to wait through the weekend, I want to get through the open house, I want to see if we can get 10 or 15 or 20 offers on the table, our offer strategy would have changed at that point. We would have created an escalation clause in the offer, which would then have set a cap for that escalation, but giving them the opportunity to maybe actually pay less than they ended up paying. So, there's always this risk on both sides of the transaction of leaving money on the table when you make the decision. But when you've got a sure thing, and we weren't coming in at list price, we came in significantly above, and the seller trusted that we could get the job done, which, is an example of really knowing the landscape and, like you say, working the psychological elements to this to where we could get our folks into transaction.
Yeah, and like you said, Kip, this is really a situation where to effectively employ this strategy, you need to be making a pretty compelling offer. So, definitely the fact that we were above list, we had an all-cash offer on the table, that's what really made this possible.
I agree.
And you also mentioned escalation clauses, and I think, this is kind of an interesting discussion to go into a bit because there are some sellers' agents who won't accept escalation clauses. And from the seller's perspective, there's a compelling element for not accepting escalation clauses because we've had situations where, our buyers have come in with a escalation clause where they're willing to go up to an amount which is quite far above list price. And them going up to that full amount is basically dependent upon other people coming in, at a similarly high amount. Because the way that escalation clauses are written is that you as a buyer are going to come in X number of dollars above the next highest offer. So
up to a cap of.
Right. So it creates a situation where if you're a seller, then, if you're accepting escalation clauses, you might have somebody put less money on the table than they might have been willing to otherwise. And you end up, not getting as much out of them as you potentially could have.
Right. And as I recall, you had a listing a few months ago which employed a very interesting seller negotiation technique, because we're talking about negotiations, not necessarily just from the buyer standpoint, but you employed a pretty nifty seller negotiation technique. Why don't you talk more specifically about that transaction?
Yeah. So I had a listing in Brownsville, and, if you're not too familiar with the local geography around Eugene, Brownsville is about 40 minutes or so north of Eugene. You go north on I-5, and Brownsville
is rural and farmy.
It's rural and farmy, has less than 2,000 people. So, Brownsville, it's not exactly the kind of place where you would expect to see a bidding war happen.
Right. You're not expecting to have 30 people beating down your door to buy the place.
But the thing is, particularly with Eugene, Springfield's markets becoming more and more competitive, what we've seen is that a lot of this competitiveness is extended even to these more rural communities,
That's right.
Like Cottage Grove south of Eugene, Junction City to the north, and Brownsville.
Yeah, funny enough.
So I had a listing. This was a, kind of turn of the new millennium property, fairly unremarkable in terms of its finishes.
Right. So newer construction, but not new construction.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially for Brownsville.
It did have a nice feature was that, it backed up to public land. So, there wasn't going to be anybody kind of on the other side of the house. So had a bit more secluded feeling. But apart from that, it was a fairly unremarkable property. Before I listed the property, I ran the comps. I determined that, kind of the market value of the home was around $330,000. So after we listed it, within several days, we had a couple of offers coming in. One of these offers was a all-cash offer. They came in at $350,000, if I remember correctly. $350,000, that's $20,000 above list, all cash, pretty compelling,
Right, especially for Brownsville.
Yeah, certainly. And then another offer came in that this was a financed offer, and they came in at $340,000. But the offer included an escalation clause where they would go up to $380,000, paying up to $3,000 over the next highest offer. So in this particular situation, there were only two offers on the table. The other one was at $350,000. So this offer would have come in at $353,000. The $353,000 offer with the escalation clause would have been financed compared to the $350,000 all-cash offer. So it seemed pretty clear-cut in this situation that, hey, all-cash offer is going to win.
It's going to close quicker.
We can close much quicker.
They got the money.
There are less contingencies. It's just going to be a cleaner transaction. And I think they also included that the inspection was only going to be for informational purposes, that they weren't going to ask for any repairs or any seller concessions, related to the condition of the property. So it basically seemed like a win. My kind of first reaction was just to go back to the all cash offer and say, hey, you have the better offer and our folks are happy. You're above list price. So let's just run with this. But I knew that, hey, these folks, their escalation went up to $380,000, and
there's money there to be
there's
had.
money there to be had potentially. So, I wanted to go back to that agent and say, hey, look, as your offer's written, we're not going to be able to accept you, but your buyer communicated that they were willing to go up to $380,000. So how serious are they? And it turned out the buyer was very serious. They were completely in love with this property and were basically completely willing to put that much money on the table without any questions particularly about, how much the other offer had come in at.
Right.
So basically, we made a verbal commitment that we would counter them at $380,000 and that they were going to accept. So we ended up getting $380,000, and it took a little bit longer to close. There was the inspection contingency, but actually, after the inspections happened, there were a couple of issues that popped up where they did want the seller to perform some repairs, but the sellers were out of state during that time, and it just would have been complicated to arrange that. But the buyer was, so eager to get into the property at that point, they just said, hey, you know what? Forget about the repairs. Let's just, just do this in the cleanest way possible. Let's forget about the repairs and close this thing.
Yeah. So that's a great example of, having the forethought to go back to that financed offer and give them another opportunity. A lot of agents would have just been, well, we can get you 53, instead of 50. So
yeah, and this is just a huge factor that really separates, decent maybe agents from really good agents who are going to take that extra step or two or three, to really get you the best deal possible.
Right. And so using that example, being the devil's advocate for the buyer's side, even though they were really enthusiastic about the place, where I would have pushed on the seller, your seller, if I had been representing the buyer, say, look, we're literally $50,000 over the original list price, which is a lot of money. We're asking for, let's say $10,000 in repairs. Why don't we knock 10 grand off the sales price? Or why don't we, I understand your seller is not able to do repairs. Why don't we give a closing cost credit? And I wouldn't have been shy about that at that point because, we're in contract now. We're kind of locked at the hip. And so any previous offers that have come and gone are, at best, you've got a backup offer in your back pocket. So, here again, in that negotiation for both buyers and sellers, there's always these pivot points where if we're really doing the job that we've been hired to do and earning the money that we make on these transactions, we are looking at all the different ways to benefit our buyer or seller throughout the entire course of that transaction. I mean, great for your seller. Good job. But it would have been nice for that buyer to maybe have gotten a buck or two for the improvements.
Certainly. I mean, it was almost too easy from my perspective.
Right. Your seller would have been, hey, that's great.
They certainly would have. They were already, $50,000 over list. So $40,000 over list. Hey, and, the repairs weren't even quite on that level. It was really, the property was relatively newer. There wasn't anything seriously wrong with it. So I think part of what was happening there was that, you have these agents who are working in these extremely competitive markets like Eugene. I think the seller's agent or the buyer's agent, in this case, is working out of Salem, where there's a lot of competition. And from the buyer's side, you're just used to having to make all sorts of compromises.
That's
to basically completely cave to give the seller every single thing that they want. And I think oftentimes buyers don't recognize, particularly once you enter into contract, you do end up having a bit of leverage.
That's right. Sometimes.
Sometimes. And as a buyer's agent, you don't just want to cave into every single thing that the seller demands. You want to find those places where you do have some leverage. You do have some capacity to, maybe get your buyer something.
Absolutely. And I think that these inflection points, especially once you're in contract, first of all, you're not out of contract if you ask. You ask for $10,000 in closing costs and the seller says no. Well, you're not out of contract unless you have reached an impasse with that ask, right? You go back as a buyer and say, well, I really do love this place. So the seller wasn't willing. I'm going to continue to move forward. But to not ask is just, It blows my mind, honestly. But that's what this episode is about, is illustrating these different inflection points in the transaction where you, as a buyer, for instance, may have very little leverage and you can't ask for things. And by asking for something, in fact, as a quick another example, we had an offer last week where we did an escalation clause. Our escalation price was very competitive. And we ended up not being chosen. Our offer did not get accepted. And the agent made a point to come back and say, you wanted to use the title company that you wanted to use, not the one that I put down that we wanted to use, implying that somehow that was part of the determination, which maybe it was and maybe it wasn't. But the point here is maybe it could have been. In this particular case, after talking to the agent, it really wasn't. But that's an example of those places where something that seems pretty benign in the asking could be the one thing that's just like, for sellers, when they've got 15 offers to look at, they're really splitting hairs fine. And so the smallest ask could turn into a turnoff for a seller that just disqualifies your offer based on just the smallest thing. So it really is tricky on the offer side to ask for anything. But once you get into contract, I think that's when it's incumbent upon your agent to really use that as a possible position of leverage to see if you can claw back some of that money that you offered from the beginning of the transaction.
Completely agree.
So another transaction that comes to mind, a recent transaction, is we had some clients that came into the area. If you listened to our program last week, Kip's tips was come into the area and live for a while. If you're relocating from out of area, the best way to find success in purchasing a home in our markets right now is to get on the ground and be ready to jump at a moment's notice. And so they had relocated from out of area. They were renting here. They weren't particularly in a big hurry to buy, but they went to an open house and they found a house that they really liked. And because they were here on the ground, we were able to move very quickly and make an escalated clause offer. Here again, with a very generous cap to our escalation. And I think there were 4 or 5 offers in addition to ours. We ended up winning the day and getting into contract. And for my folks, they ended up not having to approach anywhere near what their cap of their escalation was, which is one of the benefits for buyers. We had a capped escalation of $650,000 on a property that was listed for $575,000. And we ended up going into contract for $608,000. So these escalation clauses allow you to go really deep down the field if you have to. But the upside is if the other offers are not as strong as yours, you might save a buck or two. But they were absolutely willing to purchase that home for $650,000.
Yeah, and only had to do 608. I mean, from the listing agent's perspective, it begs the question, why they didn't try a bit harder to pull some levers to get that price up a little bit. I mean, I know that the offer was written as such that, their offer was effectively $608,000. But, going back to my example,
exactly.
There ended up being some wiggle room there, which I was able to explore in that situation. And, I know that you might drive a harder kind of bargain in this case.
I would have been harder on it, but what the point is here is this is an example of being on both sides of a transaction like that, where you representing the seller were able to effectively increase the purchase price by $30,000, which is no small sum. And then on my side of the transaction, I was able to save my clients $42,000 because the listing agent didn't approach it the way you did for your listing. So, hopefully these examples give both buyers and sellers a sense of how important it is to have an advocate that really is very deeply knowledgeable and has a bunch of tricks in their bag. I mean, we're treating each one of these transactions as individual transactions with their own life to them and circumstances. There's no one way to negotiate, I guess is the point.
Yeah, and when we talk about negotiation, I mean, yes, there is an offer as it is written, but, an agent who is really willing to pull from their bag of tricks as far as negotiation goes knows that there's always some flex, in terms of, an offer as it's written. It's not set in stone until both parties have signed on the dotted line.
That's right. That's right. And the way I articulate that is everything's negotiable, right? And so at the beginning of the negotiation, buyers are really at a serious disadvantage for sure. Once you're in contract, then there are definitely some inflection points during the inspection contingency, during the appraisal contingency, where there are opportunities for your agent to go back to the seller, go back to the listing agent and renegotiate price or renegotiate terms to kind of offset some of the, defects, or if the home doesn't appraise at value. And so the takeaway here this week is don't get stuck negotiating with, one strategy in mind. I think it's really super important to be represented by somebody who has a lot of experience in selling real estate and has a lot of creativity in their approach and the way that they negotiate. We're in times right now where prices are continuing to go up, interest rates are going up, and any advantage that you can get working with a professional that's going to help you save money or help you make money is super important.
So I think that one particular area maybe to linger on is the inspection process, because this is a huge place where negotiations happen, where the buyer gets an inspection, the inspector has certain findings, and there ends up being a negotiation, whether that's asking the seller to perform repairs or to offer some concessions in the form of a credit or a reduction in the sale price. And Kip, I know that you have extensive experience as a general contractor, and you really have, I think, a kind of window into these inspection reports that most agents don't have, where you can really understand, what an inspector has come back with, what the potential costs are involved, with different issues which can pop up around properties, in both of the markets that we serve. So in a sense, you kind of have an advantage, the way I see it, in terms of negotiations there, where you have a perspective which many agents simply don't have. And that expertise, you can really offer that in service of your clients when arguing for repairs or for credits.
Yeah, and I think it can cut both ways. So sometimes the inspection report will come up with a lot of stuff. And for potential buyers, just the sheer number of things can be scary and seem like it's going to be a lot of money, that you're going to be stuck with a huge bill for potential repairs once you take ownership of the home. And so that ability to look at the inspection report, confer with the inspector, and put into perspective some of these things that are a big deal or not a big deal. And in the case of them not being a big deal, maybe say, look, this is not the place to be trying to squeeze some money out of the seller. We'll end up, souring the deal if we're going to ask for, switch plate covers that are cracked to be replaced, or, a small drywall repair to be done. But the flip side of that is to be able to look at these things that come up on the report that may seem more benign than they are, and be able to explain to them, what the actual costs of the repairs are going to be, and create a strategy to go back to the seller with, if we have, through the offer process, allowed for kind of a renegotiation. And I guess that's one thing that we ought to talk about in negotiations. When we get to the contract offer phase, sometimes we may add, as an added incentive for the seller to pick our offer, to do an inspection for, air quotes in the air, informational purposes only. And what that means is that we are getting an inspection done. We want to make sure that there's no huge hidden problems with the property that would prevent you from wanting to move forward with the sale, but we're not going to ask the seller for repairs. And if we are offering that as an additive incentive to sellers to accept our offer, when we get to the inspection phase, well, we've kind of set up front, we're not going to ask you for anything. We're just doing this to make sure that we're not going to inherit a $30,000 foundation problem, for instance. And so that still doesn't prevent us from maybe getting into another negotiation phase. So if something major does come up, let's say we do find a $30,000 foundation issue that the seller was not aware of. Well, we would go back to the listing agent and say, we've found a non-starter problem on the inspection report, and our intention is we're going to move on and terminate the transaction unless, and then let the agent stew a little bit and maybe say, if you're a good agent, you're going to say, hold on, let me talk to my seller. They don't want to inherit this problem. They're going to have to declare it on their seller disclosure statement now. If you back out, and I'm going to have to declare this as a problem, can we stay in transaction? So that's an example of, we're not going to ask for the small stuff, but we still might be able to stay in contract, even though we said we're not going to ask you to make that repair. Maybe you'll offer to us to keep us in contract to come back to the negotiation table. So you provide them an opportunity to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's just an example of what we were talking about before, that there's always room for negotiation. And that's, one feature which separates a great agent from a not so great agent is the recognition of that fact.
Yeah, and to know when to jump into that opportunity and to know when to not to, when you could sour the deal by getting too nitpicky about something. And it's as much an art as it is a science. And it's also a matter of just really understanding where each principle to the transaction is. How antsy is your client if they're the buyer? How antsy is the client if it's the seller? And trying to be in tune with where people's energies are when it comes time to maybe push some of those levers.
Well, it seems that we're running out of time, so I think it's about time we wrap things up. But any other final parting words of advice as far as negotiation goes?
Well, the biggest one I've already offered is that you need to have a very skilled, competent agent in your corner to be able to navigate these waters of negotiation. Yeah, other than that, thanks for listening to the show this week.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, we're almost to the end of this week's episode of the Real Estate Revolution podcast. I'm Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate. The show would not be able to end without another installment of Kip's Tips. And this week's tip from Kip is, don't always listen to what your barber tells you. What do I mean by that? Well, so most people, they get a recommendation of an agent that they're going to use. So if you're looking to sell your home, you might call up friends and family and say, I know you just sold your house. Who did you use? Did you like them? And you go off and hire them. Or you're sitting there getting your hair cut and you listen to your barber talking about they just got their house on the market and they're using brand X, Y, and Z. And you're like, well, I'm getting ready to sell my house. So if it's good enough for my barber, it's probably good enough for me. And I guess the question that I would have for you is, if you were going to hire somebody to watch your children or do your taxes or cut open your chest to do open heart surgery, would you take your barber's word for it? Probably not. I'm guessing. I hope not. What I hope you would do is interview your barber's agent and then go out and interview 2 or 3 other agents. And the idea here is you want to get them in the same room with you. You want to compare and contrast their presentation. And it's as important to hire somebody who, seems to know what they're doing. They've been in the business for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. That would imply that they know what they're doing, which doesn't necessarily mean that they know what they're doing, but it would imply that. And ask the right questions, because true to this week's episode, you want to make sure that, hey, you could be in the business for 20 years in real estate and not have any idea how to negotiate a transaction. And that's just true. And so if you're going to believe our word that it's important, one of the skill sets that you want your real estate agent to have is to be a fierce negotiator on your behalf, then you want to ask the right questions to see if they really have that skill set. And then Another element that is equally as important is the vibe. If you're a buyer and you're going to be running around for several weeks, or maybe in this case, in this market, maybe several months looking at homes and be, interacting with your agent for an extended period of time, it's important that you vibe with them, that the energy is good, that the personality type is, congruent with your own. And so this week's tip is, interview more than one agent, will you? Anyway, thanks for listening to our show this week. We have another great show for you next week, but I'm not going to tell you until next week what it's about. Thanks.
Thank you for joining The Revolution. We are over and out until next week, when we'll continue to fill you in on all that matters most in our local Bend and Eugene real estate scenes. See you next time on The Real Estate Revolution.